Pals. So a quick video today because a few of you are asking about the final sequence of Apocalypse Now. So I just kind of want to go through maybe 8, 9, 10 kind of key things to think about within that final sequence for your scene analysis, okay? So again, as ever, now would be a good time to kind of familiarise with that sequence. I'd go pretty much from when Willard is on his way to kill Kurtz in the compound, the killing of Kurtz, and then all of the aftermath up until the final images of that. So go for it. Pop it on. Welcome back. Key thing to talk about first, and maybe the most significant stylistic aesthetic trait of the sequence, is the cross-cutting, okay? And it creates this incredible juxtaposition between the killing of Kurtz at the hands of Willard and the slaughter of the caribou, I think it is, at the hands of the villagers in the village where the sequence is set. Okay, so it creates this kind of incredible juxtaposition between the two. A couple of things to say about this cross-cutting, okay, this kind of cross-cutting editing. The first thing to say that it's kind of narratively, the whole sequence narratively, it's kind of unimportant, the killing of the bull. The killing of the bull itself doesn't contribute anything to the narrative. It's added into the slaughtering of Kurtz in pure symbolism. It's purely symbolic decision. And this idea of kind of forgetting about narrative to focus entirely on something symbolic is a hallmark of the New Hollywood movement, where it didn't always have to be something that would propel the narrative in that kind of Bordwell cause and effect kind of way. So this is a hallmark of New Hollywood, one of the things that defines its production context, and clearly is an influence from the work of Jean-Luc Godard and the French New Wave, wherein it wasn't necessarily about propelling narrative all the time. It was about moments, it was about meaning, it was about symbolism. Okay, so that's what that is. Another thing about the juxtaposition and the cross-cutting that's created here is that this is a hallmark also of Coppola's work. So Coppola is kind of famous as part of his kind of auteuristic trait. One of his auteuristic traits is to take two sequences that are happening at the same time, that are happening parallel to each other, and then through parallel editing or cross-cutting editing, whatever it is that you want to call it, he creates a kind of thematic or symbolic juxtaposition by showing us two things happening at the same time. The most obvious other example of this in his work is in The Godfather Part 1, the baptism sequence. So we have that incredible juxtaposition between the baptism at which Michael is the godfather, and also then we are cutting between the baptism itself and a series of murders taking place at the same time that Michael has ordered. And it creates this incredible juxtaposition between life and death and innocence and corruption and all of these massive kind of binary oppositions. But it also indicates to us just how corrupt Michael has become at this point. This is the first kind of wave of killings he's ordered. It's a shift for him morally. And it's also juxtaposed with the kind of the supposed purity of what's happening with the baptism. So we have this back and forth. And this is similar to what Coppola does here by juxtaposing the bull with the killing of Kurtz, as if they're one and the same. What it forces us to do is it forces us to see the bull as Kurtz. Okay, so we come to see Kurtz and the bull as the same thing. And if the bull is being sacrificed, then the suggestion then is that Kurtz is being sacrificed. And if he's being sacrificed, if he's being made a martyr, if this is sacrificial, then does that indicate an ideological or a moral perspective? Is Coppola suggesting that Kurtz is right? That if someone's to be sacrificed, if someone's to become a martyr, the suggestion is that it's for a cause. And Kurtz seems to kind of prepare himself for death, almost will or instruct Willard to do it, and then Willard does it. So one of the most interesting things to grapple with in this final sequence is Willard, has he gone rogue? Has he decided to take the law into his own hands and become this kind of vigilante, become this kind of avenger, and to murder Kurtz? He's gone off script, okay? Or is he just following orders in the same way that he always has done? He hasn't kind of veered out of control. He's a company man. He's an errand boy. as Willard says. So there's so much to kind of think about within that juxtaposition. One of the other things we've been talking about in relation to Apocalypse Now is the journey that Willard is on, is the journey that Coppola is on, is the journey that we're all on when we watch this film. It's a journey from a kind of superego to id state, very similar to what we said about Vertigo. So one of the things we've got to ask ourselves or look at in this final sequence is this return to a primal state, a return to the id, a rebirth into a primal kind of position. So if you think about kind of Lance, the character of Lance at this point, he is now completely devoid of his army uniform, completely stripped of any kind of sense that he's a Westerner, and he's kind of dressed in the same kind of primitive dress costume design within the mise-en-scène as the villagers, and he's actually taking part in the slaughter of the caribou. So the idea is kind of like that Lance has returned to a kind of primal state at this point. The other kind of parallel to this is Willard, who just before he goes to kill Kurtz emerges from the water, and that is often used in cinema, that kind of emergence from water as a kind of symbol of rebirth, the idea of being reborn into a different state. And I think we can clearly say here that what Will is being reborn into is a kind of primal state. He's returned to the id and is now about to commit a kind of brutal act of murder. So the idea that these Westerners who have kind of like been wrapped up in the army and capitalism and the Western world, this complete superego, have now on the course of their journey down the river shed all of those things and have now embraced or been reborn into a primal state. Interesting thing here in terms of the non-diegetic soundtrack, we are back at the start. Okay, so we return to the Doors song The End, which soundtracks this last part, the more chaotic part of the song and the more chaotic part of the film. Okay, and one of the interesting things to ask ourselves about why Coppola decides to use the same non-diegetic soundtrack at the beginning and at the end is to ask ourselves about this idea of the cyclical nature of the film. We talked about this at the beginning. Have we kind of come full circle? Okay, does the film kind of come back on itself? Does the film start at the end and then get there as well? So if it does that, it's a fragmented narrative. It doesn't take place in a linear kind of order, which would be a very new Hollywood thing to do as well. Another more symbolic idea is to think about the same non-diegetic soundtrack and ask, well, is this a suggestion that nothing has been achieved, that we are right back where we started, that the epic journey that this man has been on, that we've all been on, has ultimately led nowhere? We're back in a world of violence and pain and American aggression, and that this journey to the self has been ultimately futile because we're back at the beginning again. So the use of the song bookending the film could suggest that. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about at the end is lighting, I think. Incredible use of lighting by Coppola. Again, if we think about our three-point lighting system, we have removed the fill light, we've removed the backlight at certain points on Willard, and we get this kind of divide down his face. Now we'll talk about that a bit more towards the end. In the killing sequence, what I'm interested in, the build-up to the killing sequence anyway, is a removal of the key and fill light and instead just the backlight. And as we know, what this does is creates a silhouette. So both Willard and Kurtz become kind of silhouettes at various points in the sequence. When we see a silhouette in cinema, we can often kind of read that the person, a couple of different ways, but here I think that the person has become dehumanized, that the person no longer has these kind of like defining human characteristics. They've become something less than human, or that they become something more than human. So let's look at both of those things. The less than human idea, that they become dehumanized, means that perhaps they've shed the superego, they've shed the restraints, and now they're in this primal state. They're no longer fully human, and they act out on these primal urges. War has dehumanized these men. The other way to look at it is that instead they are now more than human, that the silhouette renders them as kind of symbols. We don't see their characteristics, we can only see their outlines. They are now symbols of something greater. And we have to ask ourselves what that is. Maybe it's that they're both symbols of the same thing. That's why he treats them with the silhouette, and that's interesting because it ties them both together again. It's this idea that they're one and the same. It's been a journey into the self, which is a familiar auteur trait of Coppola, the idea of self-exploration, the journey to the self. And that's really the journey Willard has been on, from superego to id, embracing this kind of primal state. But he's been reckoning with himself on this journey as much as he's been reckoning with the idea of Kurtz. So to have them both as silhouettes ties them both together. Are they both symbols of Western men who have been entirely ruined by this war, by the Vietnam War, and who are ultimately just cogs in a giant corporate capitalist Western imperialist machine? They're both, the victims of kind of that American military system. They've been manipulated, into committing various atrocities and acts, and they ultimately are going to end up in the same place. So the silhouette and lighting perhaps kind of suggests that to us. One of the most incredible parts of this final sequence is after the killing of Kurtz, is when Willard sits down at the table of Kurtz in his chair in front of his typewriter, and in terms of the mise-en-scène, his props in front of his things, and he's filmed again in silhouette. It's just a backlight on him. And this is really interesting because Coppola seems to be suggesting here that all that's happened is Willard has replaced Kurtz. It's a literal swap, like for like. And this idea that Willard is opposed to Kurtz is just nonsense at the end, and that's one interpretation of this. That instead, Willard is just another white, male, Western occupying force. He's killed one of these, and now he himself is another to replace it and rule over these people. And it's the idea that this will never end. Again, that cyclical idea that this is just a constant of imperialism, of American imperialism throughout the ages, that Willard just literally replaces Kurtz by sitting at the typewriter, sitting in his chair. Another reading of this is that it's a meta commentary, that we stray now into meta-narrative. The whole film can be read as that, right? That this is... Remember that Coppola had no idea what the ending was going to be. And also the film was a great physical struggle. They actually did go down that river. They actually did come up against tornadoes and helicopters and a civil war and all of these different things. So Coppola's journey was real to a certain extent to find the ending of this film, to find who he was. He went on a personal journey across the film in the same way that Willard does. So the fact that Coppola was really struggling for an ending, he was rewriting every night on his typewriter, that he would eventually sit down at his typewriter and write the ending, seems to me that this scene is also a meta-commentary on that, because Willard literally, as a silhouette, so he becomes a symbol of something else, Coppola, sits down at a table in front of a typewriter and at the end of the film, as Coppola would have done maybe the night before, maybe on that morning, to write this ending. So it becomes so personal, and that we can link to Coppola as an auteur, but we can also link it to New Hollywood, that these were incredibly, incredibly personal films. Then Willard kind of steps away from the typewriter and kind of out and looks down at the compound, looks down at the villagers. And it's a really interesting kind of use of cinematography, lighting and power to suggest ideas about power at this point, okay? Because we have some of our kind of basic techniques. We've got a low angle, low camera angle, which looks directly up at Willard from the perspective of the villagers and places him as this kind of powerful force above them, looking down at them, okay, as this white Western male occupying imperialist force at this point, okay. He looks incredibly powerful in terms of his performance and his body language, etc. He looks like an incredibly physically imposing figure as well, which is accentuated by the low angle cinematography. Okay, a wide-angle lens is used as well to accentuate what's before him when it cuts to the reverse angle, as if to suggest this is all his now if he wants it, if he's willing to take it, which is something that Americans have been doing, and Western forces have been doing for centuries. Okay, and then we cut to a close-up of him, and we have then that different use of the three-point lighting system. So instead of just a backlight to create a silhouette, what we have instead is we have the removal of the fill light, and we just have this key light, and it creates this kind of split down the middle, as if to suggest he's in two minds about what to do. He's in this moment making the decision. Do I stay here, occupy the same space as Kurtz has done, with all this power and all this control? And that must be an incredibly tempting thing for him at this point. But also on the other side, he understands that this would be a terrible decision, that he's come here to destroy Kurtz and everything that Kurtz stood for and everything that Kurtz had done. Kurtz was a hypocrite, someone who was apparently fighting against the American imperialists, but who had just become one in his own way, in control of these villages. So he's in two minds, and the camera literally splits him down the middle and shows us those two sides to him. It's the duality of man, which is something, again, that Coppola is really, really interested in. And it's about the decision he's going to make at this point. And as we know, he decides to take what we assume is the right path, the right moral path. He kind of like walks back down to the villagers. He places, in terms of the mise-en-scène, his props, he places his gun down, he collects Lance, and he returns to the boat. So he makes a kind of the right moral decision at the end of this, as opposed to the one that we would imagine he was going to make at certain points in the narrative. He's been that anti-hero, remember. Finally then, I just want to speak about those last images, where we return to the kind of collage, cross-dissolve style editing of the opening sequence. It's an incredible kind of collage and overlaying of different imagery. And a lot of that imagery is familiar to us from the opening sequence, again reinforcing the cyclical narrative structure of the film. So we get this collage, cross-dissolve within the editing, okay? And what's most interesting about that is that we end up eventually with, on one side of the screen, the face of Willard, and on the other side of the screen, the face of the statue of Buddha, which we mentioned at the beginning as well. And we have them both there, both given equal weight, okay? And we're thinking about the decision that Willard has made about what route he's going to go down. He's been this white Western male occupying force in a kind of Eastern civilization. And as we talked about before, there's this kind of suggestion that Eastern civilization and Eastern philosophies are far more associated with inner peace, calm, tranquility than Western philosophies, which are driven by capitalism and driven by violence and aggression. And so we've almost got these two different philosophies presented to the audience at the end via the juxtaposition, the cross-dissolve of Willard and the Buddha. And what's so interesting about the film is that you can interpret it as having a kind of hopeful message. You can interpret it as making a decision, that it's not entirely ambiguous, because really what happens out of those two images is that Willard's face fades away, and we are left with the statue of the Buddha's face as the final image. It's very, very clear. And what that seems to suggest, if we interpret it this way, is a rejection of Western philosophy, a rejection of Western imperialism, and a kind of embrace of a new way of seeing things. And remember, the Americans lost the Vietnam War. Okay, and it's this idea that we need to learn from it, perhaps, is what Coppola is talking about. We need to heal. There needs to be peace going forward. We're left with a symbol of peace. And that in its own way, for a film that's quite nihilistic and quite bleak and quite violent, quite morally ambiguous, you could argue that its ending is none of those things, that it's actually quite peaceful and calm, and that it suggests a way forward, which is something people don't often talk about in relation to Apocalypse Now. Hope that's helped. Cheers, lads. See you next time.